Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? Well, it's Tuesday, August 22nd, and let's see if everything's going on okay. I gotta wait for the thumbs up from Justice. Everything says, all right, it's on. You know what must have happened today? I probably didn't, I know what it was. I didn't reset my soundboard correctly, and so, all right, all of the prelude music wasn't there, but the music underneath me now is there. You just didn't hear it until I turned it on. Although maybe the soundboard isn't playing. All right, well, we'll try and turn it on and then off again. That's the way we solve almost everything in technology these days. There we go. All right, I can see it coming on now. And there's the music. So that sounds like an unusual start. And what better day to celebrate discombobulation and the continuation of Trump's surrender week. Okay, well, all right. Occasionally there are a few steps of the setup that occasionally fall by the wayside when we're scrambling in the morning. But we're here, so that's good news. And that's really all that matters. I don't know. I have nothing else to say about that. I apologize. And yeah, we're all discombobulated and in disarray today. And I will say this, even though he's probably not able to listen today because he too is so busy. I just happened to notice on the social medias that our good friend Mighty OCD, usually sitting and listening, or I don't know, maybe running in circles for all I know while he listens to the show. Moving homes today. It looks like he was tweeting, or, social media-ing on several platforms about the fact that he was moving today. And good luck. It sounds like you probably will be disconnected during the show. But hey, screw you, man. Why are you taking care of your own life instead of sitting here listening to this show? All right, maybe later, and you'll listen to the podcast and you'll be astonished at why is he paying attention to what I'm doing, and is that creepy and weird? The answer is yes, but it's your own fault for tweeting your life on social media, as we all do. Okay, let's see, other things to catch up with. There's people whose movements are part of the news. We could follow what's going on there. Trump, of course, we're all on surrender watch, and the latest word is I don't know. Well, the latest word is my music didn't work. But before that, there was word that Trump was going to, one, not participate in the debate, which is tomorrow night. Today being Tuesday. Did I do the date? August 22nd, 2023? Okay, now we're caught up. And so Wednesday night is the debate, but he's not going because why would he bother, right? And the only thing that can happen is he ends up being attacked by various people. And while he would have the opportunity to yell at them and say, well, that guy who said that is very fat, or something like that, very clever, good stuff. On the other hand, right, so no opportunity to do anything, and why not steal the spotlight? And he's mad at Fox News. There's that dynamic. He's a very complex person, but he really does have motivations. They're terrible and petty and childlike, but they're there for everyone to see. So yeah, he's mad at Fox News because reasons. There are several, and too numerous to mention. But at any rate, yes, he's upset with them and he wants to stick it to them. They're hosting the debate, so he's not going. That's one reason. He has also found, I'm sure he's been advised, you can dominate the news cycle by not going to the debate. If you go to the debate, you'll still dominate the news cycle, but the news cycle will be about things that people said to you in the ways that you insulted them back. It won't just be Donald Trump, Donald Trump, Donald Trump. There'll be other players involved. So why give them an audience? You're winning by 1,000,000 points. Don't go, right? That's, I think, conventional wisdom for him not to go. Then, I think he's been advised, or else we're all backfilling in this reasoning, which that could be it too. We may be thinking about this a lot more than he is. But if he doesn't show, then they have the debate, but still all the discussion is about how Donald Trump didn't show and how the debate would be different if Donald Trump had been there. I think this too plays into it with his beef with Fox News. he knows that their ratings would skyrocket if he were in the debate, and so he's withholding that from them and then going to brag, it was the worst rated debate ever. If I had been there, they would have broken all the records for, you can see how that would go. So, then, word is that he will turn himself in to Georgia authorities on Thursday rather than Friday, which is the deadline. And I guess my original thought was, well, he doesn't want to turn himself in. He doesn't want to go through that. He'll delay it as long as possible, unless he pulls the stunt like saying, well, he won't go to the debate and he'll turn himself in Wednesday evening and say, I couldn't be at the debate because I was being persecuted as the most persecuted white Christian person in the whole world, etc. That sort of, excuse, but I don't know if they would have processed him at night. They might have said, come in Thursday. So I guess the compromise plan is he will boycott the debate on Wednesday, turn himself in on Thursday. Now, when he boycotts the debate, or whatever he decides to call it, on Wednesday, he's also going to try to stick it to Fox and everybody else, and Twitter as well, which, remember, they treated him very, very unfairly. And even though Elon Musk owns it now, something, other reason, that guy's richer than me, and I'm angry, I don't want to be around him, whatever it is. So his decision is, although, no, actually, now that I think about it, he's gone. Well, I understand he's going to spend Wednesday going on Tucker Carlson's show, which I think is partly designed to also stick it to Trump, to Fox. I'm confusing everybody here. Trump, Fox, Twitter, all melding into one organism in my mind, which is very telling and weird. But there's something to that. We might have to explore that one day, but maybe on a psychiatrist's couch rather than anywhere else. But okay. So he wants to do it that way. And, Tucker Carlson, the most vicious, white nationalist person he could find with an audience of any size and that he could recognize. A person I know. There's very few people he actually remembers and knows. Tucker Carlson, vaguely famous, and so that's where Trump will gravitate. I was going to say he wants to stick it to Twitter because Twitter treated him so poorly, but now he's reinstated there, but he has his own social media platform, so maybe he doesn't want to promote Twitter, but Twitter is where Tucker Carlson's quote-unquote show, like my quote-unquote show, airs, quote-unquote airs. And so, I don't know. At first I thought, there's also a way to stick it to Twitter, but I guess not. If he's going on Tucker Carlson's show, it's a necessary evil to give in and provide Twitter with content. So, and then of course, the bragging begins afterwards. I gave Tucker Carlson the biggest ratings he's ever received for his new show. No one has ever done this before. They're turning Twitter into a legitimate platform. I'm inventing a whole new medium just by showing up. So it's a very tempting thing for him to do. Then he'll turn himself in on Thursday. And the thinking here is this way he continues to dominate the news cycle. And instead of there being news on Thursday, well, we didn't really pay attention to the debate on Wednesday because Trump wasn't there and he was on Tucker Carlson and we all watched that. But we'll talk about the debate Thursday morning as we would normally do. But instead, everybody will be watching him surrender to the Georgia authorities. But by the way, I also want to just throw this out there as a theory. Why there's another reason that he could be turning himself in a day early. Otherwise, you would think he'd delay it as long as possible. And I'm just kidding here, but there is a non-zero chance with Donald Trump, you never know, that he reads the idea that he will, at some point by Friday, have to turn himself into the police. He may be reading that as turn myself into the police, like an act of transformative magic, and poof, I'm the police now. And I've always wanted to do that, and I'm definitely going to beat up on some people with darker skin, because, they're criminals, and maybe we should be executing them. That, he might just think that. Well, why wait until Friday to turn myself into the police, when I could turn myself into the police anytime I want? But, yeah, dominating the news cycle seems like a better bet for him, and he's just going to deny anyone else any attention. He could be still dominating the news, but why get 75% of the coverage when you can get closer to 100%? He may have to share the spotlight for a brief moment with Tucker Carlson, but nobody's going to put them on the same level. Even though we should put them on the bottom of the ocean would be that level where I believe they both belong. All right. Let's see. Things to catch up with, news to tell people, and, I got to, make sure. Oh, yeah. Looks like John Shiflett says that the scheduled tutor went a little crazy, and, looks like that didn't get his morning tweet out, but, he's letting us know, what day it is. More on this UN-sponsored International Day. What are we on? What's the International Day? International Day of commemorating the victims of acts of violence based on religion or belief. That is a very awkward name, but that's the way the UN does things. Sounds like an important day, and here the background is here in case you wanted to take a look at it, here at UN.org. Human rights related to freedom of religion or belief are in the spotlight today if you are an internationalist like John is, I guess, or at least he pays attention to what international days are happening. All right, let's see. There's definitely other stuff to talk about, and I put it all aside, and I'm going to have to go find it now. All right, so the other Trump story of the day, as I understand things, is there's now been an agreement on how much Trump will have to put up as bond to get his release from Georgia authorities. The Georgia authorities have said that they're going to aim to treat him, I guess, I don't know how they said it, but I imagine what they really mean is to treat him as much like a regular routine defendant, just anybody else, as they would, as possible. There will be things standing in the way. There'll be logistical problems. There'll be other kinds of problems. But anyway, this is the first of the 4 arraignments come Thursday, whenever he actually gets around to this one, where they've actually made him post bond. I guess he's released on his own recognizance everywhere else, which on the one hand, on a practical sense, well, that makes some sense because, everybody knows who he is. I guess reading it like old school, well, he's a former president of the United States. He's not simply going to run away and fly off to Russia and avoid justice that way. On the other hand, come on. Of course, it's as likely as ever that he would do something like this. This is the least trustworthy person ever. Never mind that he was also the worst president in history and abused the office from day one and continues to abuse it even though he no longer holds the office. So, okay, Georgia is the first one to say, well, we won't release him on his own recognizance. I mean, that never made any sense for Donald Trump. But on the other hand, the story goes that Donald Trump has access to enormous amounts of money. We're not really sure whether that's true. So anyway, I guess it's possible that he could still forfeit the bond and still be okay. But the word is that he will have to put up $200,000 as bond, which again, he claims to be a billionaire. I don't know whether that's really true or not, but being a several hundred-aire would be fine. And honestly, as a millionaire, $200,000 bond, versus I'm going to jail for the rest of my life and I'll die there, but I could live a life of luxury overseas somewhere with some rich dictator putting me up. For Donald Trump, that's not a hard question. Anyway, that's the word on the costs of this transaction. The New York Times covered it this way, and I'm sure they'll have a lot of other doodads in the reporting here because it's Maggie Haberman involved, but she's not lead writer on this one. Danny Hakim, I guess, gets first billing. She's second, and Richard Fawcett in the third place slot. Bail for Trump set at $200,000 in Georgia election interference case. Mr. Trump, who said he would turn himself in on Thursday, was told not to intimidate or threaten any witnesses or co-defendants in the case. That's the other big story, the conditions of release for him. Of course, the big story everyone now anticipates is, well, of course, he will violate all of these conditions, and we'll list them here as the New York Times lays them out. And the judge will be at a loss as to how exactly to enforce the terms. And can you go and revoke his bail and scoop him up and put him in jail pending trial or not? How will they deal with it? And Trump will be very interested to find out and try to figure it out immediately by challenging everything. So, what's the word? A judge in Atlanta set bail for former President Donald J. Trump, not Donald F. Trump, as I prefer to think of him, at $200,000 on Monday in the new election interference case against him, warning Mr. Trump not to intimidate or threaten witnesses or any of his 18 co-defendants as a condition of the bond agreement. Trump, who posted on Truth Social that he would surrender to the authorities in Atlanta on Thursday, is also sorting out logistical details in 3 other criminal cases that have been filed against him this year. Earlier in the day, federal prosecutors pushed back on a request from his lawyers to postpone a separate election interference trial in Washington, D.C., Jack Smith's, until at least April 2026, right in the middle of the midterm elections. Following the next presidential election. Like, really, come on. Under his bond agreement in Georgia, Trump cannot communicate with any co-defendants in the case except through his lawyers. That won't work. He was also directed to, quote, make no direct or indirect threat of any nature against the community. And he doesn't do anything but do that, so. That includes posts on social media or reposts of posts made by another individual. So at least they understand that that's a possibility that he'll try to use to get around the restrictions. The terms were more extensive than those set for other defendants in the case so far, which did not specifically mention social media. In the past, Trump has made inflammatory and sometimes false personal attacks on Fani T. Willis, the district attorney of Fulton County who is leading the case. That's true. Bond was set at $100,000 for John Eastman, only one half of that, $100K versus $200K for Trump. He's, of course, they describe him as one of the architects of the plan to use fake electors, fraudulent electors, to keep Mr. Trump in power, according to court filings. A lawyer for Kenneth Cheeseborough, who also developed that plan, said the same amount was set for Mr. Cheeseborough. Just a reminder that yesterday's reading was also a reminder of just how serious the charge actually is. People still kind of downplay the whole thing. Like, well, yeah, I mean, forging election papers, even for President of the United States, certainly a big deal, but, you know, electors, who are they? They're not important. We downplay their importance the whole time. But, yeah, when you take a look at the statutes and what's really driving all of this prosecution, and when we looked briefly at the 14th Amendment's provisions yesterday, they're really right up there with some of the most important officials. They're, you know, very brief service, brief tenure, and they only have that one limited function, but it's an extraordinarily important function given how we actually operate in this country. I know we've worked around it in terms of our understanding of how elections work, but it's, the framers of the 14th Amendment anyway took it very seriously. And maybe we've learned not to since then, but it is serious. Back to the article. Trump's attacks continued on Monday ahead of his bond being set. In a post on Truth Social, he called Ms. Willis, quote, crooked, incompetent, and highly partisan, right before, they imposed these conditions. So he got in one last shot, except it won't be his last shot. And he wrote also that she has allowed murder and other violent crime to massively escalate. In fact, of course, they have to point out homicides have fallen sharply in Atlanta during the first half of the year. But, let's just put that on quote-unquote Truth Social anyway. While Mr. Trump did not have to pay bail in the other criminal cases against him, the agreements posted for him and several of his co-defendants in Georgia on Monday require 5- and 6-figure sums. The defendants have to come up with only about 10% of the bail amount, though. But even that could prove difficult for some, and that's part of the other big story of the day is that Trump is not offering to pay that or attorney's fees so far for any of the other co-defendants. And they're upset and angry about it. They can't believe that the leopard has eaten their face. They debased themselves in service of Trump, figuring, well, if anything goes wrong, his deep, deep pockets or his ability to fundraise will cover us and will be taken care of. And of course, as usual, the answer is, well, no, you're taken care of in the sense that I'm going to use you for pavement under the bus. You're going to start out under the bus in service to me. You're just not going to realize it. You're going to think you're on the bus, but the bus is really, in America, in Trump's America, bus is on you. So that's it. That's life with Donald Trump. Anyway, but they do point out the defendants only have to actually put up 10% of the bail amount in cash, but that could prove difficult for some, including Rudolph W. Giuliani, the former personal lawyer for Mr. Trump, who is running out of money because of an array of legal entanglements, which is what's supposed to happen to you. Stay out of legal entanglements, and you'll only run out of money for other capitalistic reasons that will eventually destroy you. Anyway, racketeering cases like this one can be particularly long and costly for defendants. In another racketeering case in the same court involving a number of high-profile rappers, jury selection alone has gone on for 7 months. That is an interesting comparison. Okay, the costs clearly worry some of the defendants in the Trump case. One of them, Kathy Latham, a former Republican Party official in Georgia who acted as a fraudulent fake elector for Trump in 2020. And of course it was for Trump. There's never been any fraudulent fake electors before. So, you really don't even need to say that. But anyway, she has set up a legal defense fund describing herself as a retired public school teacher living on a teacher's pension. Yes, well, don't do these things then. The $3,645 she has initially raised is well short of her $500,000 goal. I guess she needs her legal expenses, but by the way, they were just saying, well, some of these people have 5-figure bails, and you're only supposed to have to come up with 10% of it. So why does she need $500,000? Probably for all the legal fees that will be ongoing in this case. Anyway, great job, and good job getting your face eaten by the leopards there. Poor you. The retired public school teacher living on a teacher's pension. I can appreciate the tension there, but then don't do crimes. Thank you. Just a poor retired public school teacher who happens to somehow have decided to falsely portray herself as occupying one of the most singular and important offices under the United States, so much so that it is mentioned directly after senators and representatives in the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. I just fell into the role. What could I do? Anyway, let's see. Jenna Ellis, a lawyer who assisted Mr. Giuliani in his efforts to keep Trump in power after he lost in 2020, expressed frustration over the looming legal costs a few days after her indictment in the case. Why isn't MAGA Incorporated funding everyone's defense? She asked last week on X, formerly known as Twitter. Good question. And the answer is because it's not for you. You're just a stupid functionary and you didn't realize that your face was Purina leopard chow from day one. Mr. Trump and the other defendants were indicted last week on charges that you know all about this, blah, 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 but they have to put that in there for some reason, like in the middle of the story, in case you're like, why am I reading this newspaper and this article in particular? And the answer is, he was indicted on criminal charges. The indictment laid out 8 ways the defendants were accused of trying to reverse the election results as part of a criminal enterprise by lying to the Georgia legislature, lying to state officials, creating fake pro-Trump electors to circumvent the popular vote, harassing election workers, soliciting Justice Department officials, soliciting Vice President Mike Pence, breaching voting machines, and engaging in a cover-up. That's actually a good that's one of the better paragraphs explaining the charges against him and categorizing it 8 different ways like that. That's good. I like that. Trump has not been required to pay cash bail in the 3 other criminal cases. We already know about that. In Atlanta, prosecutors and law enforcement officials have emphasized a desire to treat the defendants as other accused felons would typically be treated in the city's criminal justice system, with mug shots, fingerprinting, and cash bails. But the Secret Service is sure to have security demands regarding the booking of a former president, but they would have already had exercised those in the other 3 jurisdictions. But anyway, I guess they'll be particularly concerned about this one. By the way, yesterday we were saying, oh yeah, they probably, they might take this description of his, they might actually, we were trying to decide whether or not they would have both height and weight taken at the booking. And I know that anytime you see anytime you see wanted posters, I don't know, in my imagination, when I've seen wanted posters in the past, or all points bulletins being put out for people the police are looking for, they will often perhaps include a rough description of the weight, just so you have some idea of the shape of the person you're looking for. Not that that has ever mattered in any way, but we were reminded, well, no, they probably won't announce his weight. I don't think they typically do anything like that. But I did see somewhere in my email, not that this is any sort of authoritative statement on the subject, but I guess one of the betting sites, online betting sites where they bet on just about anything, is in fact offering odds on the weight, an over-under, which is pretty amazing. But also, there's I don't know how they're going to judge who wins this or what the actual call is. There's what skin tone color will Trump have in the mugshot? And there are descriptions of different shades of orange that he might show up as. And I don't know who's supposed to make the official call about that and why you would bother betting on such a thing. But there is an over-under on the weight, although it looks like it's it's moved a little bit. Bet Online initially opened the weight over-under at 265.5 pounds, but the site reports that more than 75% of the bettors wagered on over. So the current odds have moved to 273.5 pounds, although I see it's inched up again. Apparently it now stands at 278.5. That's the over-under on Trump.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We're all here, right? The music is running, everything's still working good. That's good news. No one's telling me otherwise. We'll make that assumption. So I'll send that around to everybody. Oh, I have to write the summary myself today as Scott is out. So, all right, well, I'll have to note to self. We'll be doing that. So Bet Online is the one. Running odds on various shades of skin tone during his mugshot. Again, I don't know how they'll figure that one out, but I also don't know how things are going to work with regard to weight unless they actually do weigh him. I mean, do they know something about the booking procedure? I know nothing about it. At first I figured, well, maybe they will take the weight, but I don't know. I can't imagine them releasing it publicly. I don't think that's usually part of the release, but maybe it is. And these guys, what are they going to do if they're taking bets on all this and there's just no information on the weight? But that would assume that online betting places are responsible operations from the get-go, and I'm not certain that's a particularly good assumption. But anyway, there you have it. Lots of people will demand their money be returned to them, I guess, if there's no information to help them decide whether or not the over-under bets are working out. Okay. They went out of their way to try to come up with funny descriptions of the various shades of skin tone they might assign to him, but they're meh. if you ask me. There's, I guess their favorite one is Mar-a-Lago orange, like instead of Mar-a-Lago, like marmalade, orange marmalade, Mar-a-Lago orange. I'm not very enthusiastic about these. Geriatric ginger, presidential pumpkin, and then they just start getting, they were running out of good ideas after the idea of betting on the skin tone. That was the end of the good idea. But, ballot rigged bronze, MAGA mango, you get the idea. It's a wasted effort for us to try to read these things. But okay, I thought that was an interesting subject, that there were people betting on that, and that might mean that maybe we were wrong after all, or right after all, depending on how you look at it, about them taking his weight at the booking. All right, but now back to the New York Times, which is reporting responsibly as opposed to our stupid speculation, which is much more fun. Let's see, where were we there? Oh yeah, he hasn't been required to pay cash bail in the other cases. Oh, Secret Service sure to have security demands regarding the booking. On Monday, lawyers for a number of the defendants were seen walking in and out of a complex of connected government buildings. Well, that's what they do for a living, including the Fulton County Courthouse and a government office building where they met with representatives for the district attorney's office. Duh. Of course they were. Well, there was no news to report. They didn't know what happened inside. The lawyers had little to say because they're professionals and they know what they're doing, including about when Mr. Trump might surrender. So he broadcasted on social media. They were mum about it. He told everybody what he was going to do. Soon, very soon. Oh, look, that's almost comes up here. You'll find out everything soon enough. Drew Findling, I don't know how you pronounce it's spelled like Findling. Mr. Trump's local lead lawyer told reporters, patience is a virtue. My client doesn't have any of it, but no virtue at all of any kind. Certainly no patience either. Ms. Ellis, remember, talking about Jen Ellis, she worked with Giuliani, you know who he is, in the weeks after Trump lost the election, traveling with him to various states to push claims of widespread fraud that were quickly debunked, but she has been a target of online attacks by allies of Mr. Trump for months, as she has been critical of the former president and has made supportive statements about his closest competitor in the Republican presidential primary, Ron DeSantis of Funky Boots, Florida. I was reliably informed Trump isn't funding any of us who are indicted, Ms. Ellis posted on X last week. Would this change if he becomes the nominee? Why then, not now? Well, one, he doesn't care about anybody else. And two, yeah, you did. You criticized him. So you're on the outs now. It may end up being the case that he ends up funding other people who are very good to me, very good and generous, nice people. So why should I be nice to them if they're not nice to me? That could come down to just that. Or he could say, why the hell would I pay for anybody but me? Asked about her post, Ellis replied in a text message, mounting a defense in these circumstances is exorbitantly expensive. I don't have great personal wealth and I'm doing this on my own. I have been overwhelmed and blessed with the generosity and support of Christians and conservatives across the nation who want to help me. A person briefed on the matter said that Ms. Ellis had not asked for help from a legal defense fund formed recently by Trump's advisors, but that she had sought help earlier and had been denied. So why hasn't she sought help from the legal defense fund? Because she tried earlier and they said, no, get the F out of here. So she didn't try again. Trump has used a political action committee that is aligned with him, and that is replete with money he raised in small dollar donations as he falsely claimed he was fighting widespread fraud after the 2020 election. And he's used that to pay the legal bills of a number of allies as well as his own. But other defendants have been denied help with mounting legal bills long before they were charged. Among those asking for help are Giuliani, Trump's Political Action Committee, which has spent roughly $21 million on legal fees, primarily for Mr. Trump, but also for others connected to investigations to him, has so far covered only $340,000 for Mr. Giuliani. All 19 defendants are required to turn themselves in by noon on Friday. The order said it had to be by Friday, I believe, and he plans to follow that order, Mr. Grubman said of Mr. Cheeseborough. So now you're all up to date on that, although I did also put aside a Business Insider piece, and let's see, I guess that was just to sort of make sure that I had relayed to you the fact that Trump's bond in the Georgia case is the first time that he's been, as they say in their headline, on the hook for cash in his criminal cases. So we've already got that point across. And I think I also put aside, or intended to put aside, a USA Today piece. Yes, the USA Today, their story led with Jenna Ellis complaining about not being, not having her legal expenses covered. Trump's former lawyer was indicted in Georgia. She wants his defense funds to pay her legal fees. So, well, whatever. She'll be disappointed on that front, I am sure, or at least left hanging for longer than she will be comfortable with. Is there anything else in here? No, just a description of how much she did in the plot, I guess. And there's some appearance by Matt Schlapp in all here, in case you wanted to say his name a lot and pretend you had been hit with a fish. All right. Not really. Okay. Well, I don't think that there's any necessity for reading on then through the USA Today coverage of things. All right. On to other issues here. I have a piece set aside here from the Washington Post from Jennifer Rubin, who, I never love going to as a source, but she's been an interested spectator in all of this. So we'll take a quick look at why Trump's Georgia case likely can't be removed to federal court. We know that Mark Meadows was attempting to remove the case to federal court. And just a reminder, we've kind of been discussing it on and off over the past couple of days. And one of the things that, I retained from criminal procedure in law school was that, you can remove the case from Georgia state court to federal court, but doing that, it doesn't change the venue in terms of the location, the geolocation. You would be removing it to federal court, but it would be tried in a federal court in Georgia. So, it's not like it would be moving to another state or West Virginia. I know they were hoping for at some point. And of course, moving it to Washington, D.C., that kind of venue change might make a certain amount of sense given where Mark Meadows committed the vast majority of his crimes, I think. But the jury pool is not likely to be any better there. And so why remove to federal court at all in Georgia? The thinking is that you get a better shot at a friendlier jury that way. But the other thing to keep in mind is, of course, you remove it to federal court. The idea here is so that, a federal judge would preside under federal rules in the hopes that this is sort of part of the original, concept of federalism in the courts, was they didn't want national officials or officials from elsewhere who are primarily connected with other states, if that's the case at all, being dragged into state court and mistreated as an out-of-state outsider by people who are suspicious of, back in the days of the founding, people were awfully worried about this. And I guess it's even still a possibility, right? He's from out of state. He's an out-of-state agitator, this guy. We're going to throw the book at him because we love Georgians here in Georgia, not North Carolinians or whatever the hell it is Mark Meadows actually is these days. And certainly not people from Washington, D.C. or whatever. And so you can remove your case to federal court where a federal judge would presumably be better trained in not holding you to a higher standard or a lower standard for that matter, because you're not from Georgia or something like that. And that's really it. But so it doesn't change, though, the body of law under which you're charged. As we know, the charges are still violations of Georgia law. They would still treat you as though that were the case, because it is the case. And you're tried under Georgia law, but by a federal judge under federal rules of evidence. et cetera, et cetera. But you would still be on trial for the violations of Georgia's state law. So it doesn't change a great deal. But, and I think they probably discussed this in the article here, as opposed to the jury selection would be done slightly differently. As opposed to facing a jury drawn from citizens of Fulton County, Georgia, you would instead transfer the case, if you transfer the case to, say, the Northern District of Georgia. Is that how they divide their districts in Georgia, the federal court districts? If you're tried in the Northern District of Georgia, the jury pool is drawn from the citizenry covered by that entire Northern District. So it's a little wider net. You'd be able to throw some of the, let's say, whiter and more conservative outer suburbs into the mix as well. And that could be of some advantage to defendants wrapped up in Trump's conspiracy trial. But anyway, Jennifer Rubin is covering the angle of why it's unlikely to succeed, this move to this maneuver to try to remove to federal court. And it goes like this. Former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows last week filed a petition to move Georgia's racketeering case against him from state court in Fulton County to the federal court for the Northern, District of Georgia. He was granted an evidentiary hearing on August 28th. That's next week. The removal requests raise a host of issues regarding him and former President Donald Trump in the case alleging, well, how much more do you need to know about this? You know what the case is about. Meadows will need to produce evidence to justify removal at the August 28th hearing. Of course, that's what an evidentiary hearing is. I want to hear your evidence. Why should we move this? Although all 19 defendants facing a total of 41 counts are charged with state law violations, a federal statute allows a defendant in certain circumstances to remove the case to federal court. The reason behind the statute, according to the American Bar Association, was to protect those who worked for the federal government, whether directly or indirectly, in the event that they were sued or prosecuted for conduct performed while working in their capacity as a federal officer or working under the direct control and supervision of a federal officer. I guess the idea here is, I'll go on with the description in case they actually do it, because that wasn't all that helpful. To protect against meddling with federal operations, which could occur if states were permitted to prosecute state officials in cases involving their official federal duties, the ABA explains. Federal officials could at least find a federal court and jury to adjudicate their case. It's not a huge difference, but if you think you're being targeted by a mean state government that hates the federal government, you can at least move into a federal forum and get a trial that way. In case of removal, criminal indictment would still be brought under state law, but defendants would be tried in a federal courtroom with a federal judge presiding. If convicted in this case, Meadows and other defendants would be punished under state law, and their sentences would not be pardonable under federal law. So in case you were wondering if that was the motivation, I'll move it to federal court, and then Trump can win the election or cheat and steal it, or declare himself dictator for life and then pardon me because federal court. Now, they're state charges. The federals just provided the courtroom and the judge. That's all. So, why seek removal to federal court? In the case of Meadows and perhaps other defendants, the motive might be nothing more than jury shopping. Legal scholars Lawrence Tribe, Donald Ayer, and Dennis Aftergut explained in a recent Atlantic article, herein linked, that a defendant removing his case to federal court would get a shot at a jury pool drawn from the entire Northern District of Georgia and not just Fulton County, which is seated in purple to blue Atlanta. And I would hazard to guess that the Northern District of Georgia includes Murdery Trader Green's jurisdiction. So there's some chance that she could be on the jury, for instance, just randomly. Or at least her fans. Or someone she could threaten to murder if they didn't vote to acquit you. Something like that. Anyway, defendants seeking removal to federal court might also think that there could be an advantage in putting a state court prosecutor on unfamiliar turf in a federal courtroom. Or they might prefer that the judge conduct the voir dire interview of prospective jurors, as is the case in federal court, and not the attorneys, as is done in state court. Maybe. Don't know what to think about that. And the idea that, a state prosecutor would be so unfamiliar with federal court procedure that they'd just be lost and they'd be like an unfrozen caveman lawyer, probably not really true. But anyway, I'm sure there's some learning curve, but not much. If Meadows thought he'd get a break in finding a more friendly judge, however, he might be disappointed. If Meadows succeeds in removing the case, State Court Judge Scott F. McAfee, appointed by Republican Governor Brian Kemp just this year, would be out. Seasoned U.S. District Court Judge Steve C. Jones, appointed by President Barack Obama, would be in. To the extent that the Trump gang thinks that there are Trump judges and Obama judges, Meadows might have preferred to try his luck with McAfee. In any event, Meadows' effort to scramble into federal court might well fail. The relevant statute, U.S. Code 28, Section 1, it's really 28 U.S. Code Section 1A, allows removal only if the defendant was an officer or any person acting under that officer of the United States or of any agency thereof for or relating to any act under color of such office. Well, that could be problematic. Neither Trump nor Meadows, however, had any constitutional duties regarding state certification of Georgia's own election. The framers parceled out election duties to the states. Remember the independent state legislatures, damn it. The Electoral College and Congress, but not the president. Moreover, in seeking removal, the defendant must also show that he has a colorable defense under federal law, such as immunity. In Mesa versus California, the Supreme Court in 1989 held that mail truck drivers charged with misdemeanor manslaughter could not get into federal court even though they were performing their assigned duties, driving mail trucks. Because the defendants lacked a federal defense to their charges, the court declined to allow removal of state criminal prosecutions or federal officers, and thereby imposed potentially extraordinary burdens on the states when absolutely no federal question is even at issue in such prosecutions. This is where Meadows and Trump, if he tries to follow Meadows' gambit, will likely falter. They lack a viable defense, such as presidential immunity, in trying to overturn the 2020 election, according to multiple judges. Not that they won't try it anyway, or just try to waste time with it. Federal Judge Emmett Sullivan in Washington, D.C. held last November, if former President Trump disrupted the certification of the electoral vote count, as plaintiffs allege here, such actions would not constitute executive action in defense of the Constitution. And in a separate federal case in Washington, D.C., Judge Amit Mehta rejected Trump's claims to absolute immunity against civil suits. After all, the president's actions here do not relate to his duties of faithfully executing the laws, conducting foreign affairs, commanding the armed forces, or managing the executive branch. Mehta added, these are unofficial acts, so the separation of powers concerns that justify the president's broad immunity are not present here. Going back to 1982 in Nixon versus Fitzgerald, the Supreme Court made clear that whatever immunity a president might enjoy must at the very least concern conduct within the outer perimeter of his duties. Since Trump and his cronies had no right to interfere with Georgia's election process, their actions remain far beyond the outer perimeter of their duties. Removal should therefore fail. Of course, Trump will be arguing that it is within his duties. He needs to see that the laws be faithfully executed, and it was his claim that they were not being properly executed at all, and he was intervening for that reason. So I think Rubin is jumping to conclusions based on her preferences here. They're my preferences too, but I don't know how clear it's going to be. And it certainly isn't, or it certainly should be clear by now that his lack of merit won't stop him from pressing a case anyway, if it means he can waste time with it. Trump might not take the Meadows route. The law is murky as to whether some, but not other defendants could stay behind if one defendant's case is removed to federal court. Trump seems to think judges appointed by Democrats, such as Obama appointed Jones, won't be fair. He has also shown hostility towards judges of color. Jones is black, McAfee is white. Trump will need to decide whether to chew up time, part of a delay strategy, in litigating removal or steer clear of Jones. The legal precedents are not the only reason Meadows' removal petition should be rejected. In a broader sense, removal would injure the people of Fulton County, where the alleged crimes were committed. they would lose the right to have the case tried in their locale by a prosecutor of their choosing under a judge who will stand for re-election next year and with a jury of their fellow residents. I don't think that they really have standing to make that complaint, but it's an idea. Let's not forget that this case arises in a particular context in a state tarnished by a long history of voter suppression, racial violence, and segregation. Anthony Michael Kreis, K-R-E-I-S, Kreis, an assistant law professor at Georgia State University, writing on August 15th in the New York Times, reminded us that for most of Georgia's history, the political process was neither free nor fair, as citizens were prevented from voting and lawful votes were discounted. The Southern Redeemers refused to recognize their opponents as legitimate electoral players, and conservatives abandoned the rule of law, engaging in intimidation and political violence to extinguish the power of multiracial political coalitions. At bottom, the theory behind the Fulton County indictment accuses Mr. Trump and his allies of some of these same offenses. Actually, could be a real interesting article to look at just historically for other reasons besides using it as evidence to come to Rubin's conclusion here. But at any rate, Mr. Trump and his allies could not accept that an emerging multiracial coalition of voters across the state rejected him. Election deniers focused on Atlanta, a city whose black residents total about half the population, as the place where Georgia's election was purportedly stolen. The dangerous mix of racial grievance and authoritarian impulses left Trump loyalists feeling justified to concoct the fake electors scheme and imploring the General Assembly to go into special session to arbitrarily undo the will of the Georgian voters. I added a word or two here. That's all still quoting from the New York Times piece by the Georgia State University professor. But finally, Rubin concludes, this trial would be a unique opportunity to redeem Georgia and achieve a measure of racial justice for Fulton County residents whose poll workers were targeted in the election overturning effort and whose votes Trump sought to negate. Jones, who will hold the evidentiary hearing to decide the removal issue, should vindicate these voters' interests in obtaining justice and defying yet another assault on their voting rights. It's a legal, historical, and moral imperative, therefore, to keep the case in Fulton County. We'll see whether the judges agree and all of that. I don't think it'll make a tremendous amount of difference, but because it's a complicating issue and very weedy and still sitting out there and people will be talking about it shortly, we thought we would preview it with that backgrounder for you. All right, let's see. Other things that we ought to add to the mix, but, well, we're coming up on the break here. We'll see whether we can get any of these in under the wire. Probably nothing we can finish, but since we were talking weedy stuff that might pay off to have some backgrounder, and we'll begin perhaps this piece from social media's own Pope Hat. You may know him as Pope Hat. You may know him as Ken White, which is, I guess, his real name, or at least the name under which he writes this Substack article over at his Substack, The Pope Hat Report, explaining this technical bit about conspiracy law and conspiracy charges, which you may understand innately just by your understanding of what the word conspiracy means in the general vernacular sense. But when it gets into legal stuff, the definition of conspiracy requiring overt acts or predicate acts, rather, I guess, of the sorts of things that are necessary for defendants to have done in order to establish that there's a wider conspiracy. They use some terms of art here in describing the various acts that lead to a conspiracy charge being leveled, and he's trying to help explain them. No, he says in the subheader here, Fani Willis is not making tweets or phone calls into crimes, as the Trump fans are explaining or claiming, but maybe her indictment is a bit indulgent and gratuitous. There are some not really leaps in logic, I wouldn't say, but there are some assumptions that are made that people who are legitimately, well, they're not legitimately trying to defend Trump. They may think they're trying to defend him legitimately, but what he's done is illegitimate, so there's no real way to get around to it. But until we settle these questions, there are two approaches to these various acts that were undertaken and two ways to consider them. And then, of course, the third and most disingenuous way, Trump fans are looking to excuse the behavior. Oh, sure, now they're trying to say that using Twitter is against the law. No, using it to further a conspiracy is against the law. That's what's happening. We've been over that ground. But here's his explainer, or at least the beginning of his explainer before we check out for a minute. After months of anticipation, Donald Trump and 18 people who thought it was a good idea to trust Donald Trump have been indicted by a grand jury in Fulton County, Georgia. And no, it's not a crime to trust Donald Trump, but you're likely to be charged with the crime if you do, for other reasons. Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis, notoriously fearless, particularly of cameras, is prosecuting them on a 41-count trek through Georgia criminal law. Here is a good time to remind you that I think the generalized read on Ken White, Pope Hat, is that while he's been certainly anti-Trump and been enjoying the prosecution of Trump, he is a relatively conservative person at heart and is given to things like viewing Fani Willis as a publicity hound who might even be in over her head, as opposed to a shrewd prosecutor who is merely following the case where the facts lead her. He's got that bias, and you'll see it in the writing. But he plows on nonetheless, because there's a non-zero chance that she succeeds here. So, right. So as he puts it here, Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis, notoriously fearless, particularly of cameras, right? Wink, wink, is prosecuting them, as he describes it, on a 41-count trek through Georgia criminal law, meaning a far-ranging, wide-ranging indictment. But one law leads every story and falls from every lip: RICO. Yes, Ms. Willis has charged the defendants with conspiracy to violate Georgia's racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations law, commonly known as RICO, modeled on the infamous, to defense lawyers anyway, federal statute. Georgia's RICO statute contains a core prohibition: it shall be unlawful for any person employed by or associated with any enterprise to conduct or participate in, directly or indirectly, such enterprise through a pattern of racketeering activity. What the hell does that mean? Well, he'll try to explain it after this. Okay, welcome back now, and the microphone mute button was fighting me a little bit here, so we'll just jump straight back into it, shall we? Although I am taking a look at some things coming across the Mastodon transom from Gotta Laugh, keeping on top of the morning's news, but I might have to take a look over at this one later on. But first, back to Pope Hat and his explanation of overt acts and predicate acts in the context of the RICO statute. As we gave you the legalese Georgia RICO statute definition here, it's against the law for anybody to, participate in, directly or indirectly, such enterprise, a criminal enterprise, through a pattern of racketeering activity. Well, so far, you're guilty if you have violated the definition of the statute. Well, of course you are. There must be more to it, yes? Yes, there is. The indictment charges the defendants with violation of the conspiracy component of the statute. Quoted here, "It shall be unlawful for any person to conspire or endeavor to violate any of the provisions of subsection A or B of this code section, and a person violates this subsection when 1. He or she, together with one or more persons, conspires to violate any of the provisions of subsection A or B of this code section, and any one or more of such persons commits any overt acts to effect the object of the conspiracy." All right, still gobbledygook. What's happening? After the preliminary charging language, the indictment launches into a 52-page, 161-act list of acts committed by the defendants. There's some pictures of them here. I don't know if we read any because we never did read all the way through the indictment. And but at any rate, here's one for you. Act 1 is captured from the screen here under the title of Acts of Racketeering Activity and Overt Acts in Furtherance of the Conspiracy. as part of and on behalf of the criminal enterprise detailed above. The defendants, we didn't read that, but the defendants and the other members and associates of the enterprise committed overt acts to affect the objectives of the enterprise, including, but not limited to, and then there are 161 of them, but the first one is Act 1, and here it is, on or about the 4th day of November 2020, Donald John Trump made a nationally televised speech falsely declaring victory in the 2020 presidential election. Approximately 4 days earlier, on or about October 31st, 2020, Donald John Trump discussed a draft speech with unindicted co-conspirator individual 1, whose identity is known to the grand jury, that falsely declared victory and falsely claimed voter fraud. The speech was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Now you can begin to understand. Well, making this speech and drafting it was an overt act, something you did as part of a plan to pull off this conspiracy to overturn the 2020 election. Even on October 31st, you were already planning to do that before the voting was going on. That's important too. And by the way, I've seen some people say, what is all this mumbo jumbo about on or about the 4th day of November? We know exactly what the dates were on these things. A lot of these things are written communications that are date stamped over social media or otherwise, right? Why do we say on or about? And it is just old legalese here, but it's, I think, designed, I think you could still say it's designed basically to get around finding defects in the legal proceedings by pulling off technicalities. Well, you said this on November 4th, you did this thing. Aha, I got you. It was actually 12:01 a.m. November 5th that I did that. And therefore your whole indictment is faulty and we throw it out. So to avoid things like that, you say, well, on or about. I mean, the point isn't so much, it doesn't, the whole thing doesn't turn on what time was it when you did it, but just rather that there's a generalized description that most people will understand to mean that you had a pretty good idea of about when this happened, and to the extent that it doesn't actually matter when you murdered them at 11:59 or 12:01, that were covered this way. I'm sure I could imagine that there's something that might actually legally turn on what day it actually was, in terms of making deadlines or something like that. But absent that sort of requirement, this just is a belt and suspenders way of saying, we think it was on November 4th, but if it happened to actually be November 5th, or depending on how you're measuring time, maybe you were saying, oh, I thought you meant Greenwich Mean Time. No, doesn't matter. That won't undo it, because we've used the proper magic language, on or about. Just in case you were wondering about that. Well, anyway, having quoted that first act out of the 161 of overt acts, just to give you an example, Popat continues here. This whole thing, this idea of leading our way through 161 acts here, has led to much comment and confusion. Some of it is contrived and in bad faith, and some of it reflects honest concern or confusion. The thrust of it is this. Wait. Some of the acts on that list aren't even crimes, are they? And aren't some of them speech protected by the First Amendment? Here's a not good faith example, and it stems from saying, well, wait a second here. Act 1, an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy, was that he gave a speech, or further that he drafted a speech. Why is that? That's not a crime. You're allowed to give speeches, even if they're lies. Yes, true. And that's a not good faith example. One. And here's another not good faith example. Act 140 is screenshotted here in a tweet from Natalie Winters, whoever that is, but she's a blue check mark, so she tells you right off the bat, probably not such a great person. Act 140 is described this way. On or about the 6th day of January 2021. January 6th, okay? Donald John Trump placed a telephone call to Vice President Mike Pence and solicited him to disrupt and delay the joint session of Congress on January 6, 2021, the day prescribed by law for counting votes cast by the duly elected and qualified presidential electors from Georgia and the other states. When Pence refused, Donald John Trump stated that Pence would, quote, go down as a wimp, and that Pence was not protecting the United States. This was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. So, what does Natalie Winters make of this? Oh, it is now illegal to call Mike Pence a wimp. No, it's illegal to call him and solicit him to disrupt and delay the joint session of Congress. That's actually the first act listed here. But yeah, the color commentary here is not what he's being charged with. But anyway, similar examples are also not in good faith. So which ones do have to be illegal? Which ones don't have to be illegal? What's the difference? Why can you be charged with an act that isn't itself illegal? Well, remember, it's you're not violating the law by committing this act. You are violating the law by committing this act in furtherance of a larger conspiracy. And though some of these overt acts might not themselves be illegal, the ones that are predicate acts to conspiracy are. And if you commit an overt act in furtherance of that conspiracy or those predicate acts that establish conspiracy, well, then you have an issue. I parked outside the bank we planned to rob, but I paid the meter. Is that a crime? No, it's clearly not. Might it be listed in the predicate act? Yes, if it's established, or they think they can establish in court, that you scoped out and selected that parking space because it made escape from the bank particularly easy. So you're not being charged with parking illegally, and no one says that parking there was illegal, but was it in furtherance of the conspiracy? That's the claim. That's what's being said. Political theater and propaganda aside, there are some reasonable questions here. How can a tweet like Act 101 or statements at a press conference like Act 3 be a crime? And the answer is they're not crimes, or at least that's not what the indictment claims. They are overt acts. Now, some definitions. Overt acts, originally a bulwark against tyranny, now mostly for exposition. That's the title of this next section. So what is an overt act? The section asks. A criminal conspiracy, it starts out, is an agreement by two or more people to do an illegal thing. Getting rid of some of the legalese jargon here. An overt act is some step, however small, intended to promote that illegal goal. Many conspiracy laws require, like Georgia's RICO statute here, that the government prove that at least one member of the conspiracy committed one overt act. You have to do something. You can't merely be thinking about it. That they can't charge you for. There's no need to prove multiple overt acts and no need to prove that each defendant committed one. Okay? Now, why are overt acts a thing? The requirement is a reaction to the tyrannical experiences with laws that criminalized mere thought or discussion. For instance, the Treason Act of 1351, yes, we're going way back in English common law here. Well, in this case, not common law, but a statutory law, but all the way back to our English precedents here. The Treason Act of 1351 purportedly made it a crime, quote, to compass or imagine the death of our Lord the King. Well, that would be problematic for me. Like, I keep imagining Trump's death, and I certainly did during his presidency as well, but it's not illegal to say, man, I wish he would fall down the stairs or something like that, or fall into a wood chipper. And though some people say, but he's the president of the United States, you're threatening him. No, I'm not. I'm imagining how great it would be if somebody else did all these things. But if I made an overt act to make it happen, I went and smeared grease all over the stairs, that would be a criminal act, or an overt act in furtherance of a conspiracy, if you could establish that I really had one. And of course I would be sitting here saying, oh, now you're telling me it's illegal to use grease? I mean, come on, how is that contraband? Well, smearing it all over the stairs at the White House. Did I illegally gain access to the White House? Yes, I could be charged with that, and I probably would be, but if they could prove something bigger, like, well, the reason you gained access to the White House was to grease the steps, and the reason you greased the steps was you hoped that he would fall down those stairs, et cetera, and if you agreed with somebody else to let you into the White House, or that someone would direct him to those stairs, now you're starting to see a conspiracy come together. But way back when they figured, well, you can pass any law you want. It's 1351. The king's pretty powerful. We have a broad idea about what treason actually is. Let's make it illegal to think about the death of our Lord the King. We execute people left and right here. It doesn't make much of a difference. If the king wants your head chopped off, it could be done arbitrarily. But in order to give it color of law, we'll have a treason act where the king could have you accused of thinking about killing him, and who can prove that you didn't think that, right? Well, we know that. We understand that it will be unfair and impossible for you to defend yourself. But what good is the idea of giving you a logical defense when in 1351, if the king said your head should be chopped off, your head would get chopped off because the king said it, because God told him to say it, and he was heaven's anointed, and you chopped the heads off. Otherwise, your head would be chopped off. So you just did it. But that did seem troubling to people who were sort of discovering like philosophy and logic. So they said, well, we'll just make it a legal thing. It's illegal to think about, bad thoughts about the king, and you did that. I didn't do it. Well, I say you did. That's enough for us in 1351. But later on, and probably even right then, we realized it'll work for current purposes, but honestly, this is a terrible idea. It's actually quite tyrannical to simply say, I think you thought that, so you're dead. Right. So, the Treason Act of 1351 made it a crime to compass or imagine the death of our Lord the King, something that could be and was interpreted to cover mere discussions or idle talk without action, and maybe not even talk. I just think you thought that. The Treason Act of 1351 gradually became understood to require proof of some overt act beyond mere talk, though there are disputes about whether that was mere tradition or a legal requirement, and about whether it reflected sensibilities about the adequacy of evidence of intent or some sort of minimum action requirement to qualify as a crime. Basically, they were saying, well, we have this terrible statute that actually legitimizes executing people for thinking that they thought something, but that just means everybody in the world can be executed at the king's whim. Now, that's where we kind of were at the time anyway, though maybe by 1351, they were getting away from that idea. Maybe 1251, they were very much into it. But they were looking to evolve. And they said, just so that we don't start executing everybody for everything, like judges, if we don't rule the way the king wants, the king could say, I think you thought about killing me, you're executed. They started to build some logical protection to think, well, let's at least say that there needs to be somebody saying, you know what I think? I think we ought to kill the king. Well, that's a problem. You can't do that. That's more understandable as a problem than that guy looks like he's thinking about what a good idea it would be for someone else to kill the king. Some way of differentiating between just execute everybody and, well, juries and people, and to the extent we care about what people think, people will understand this. The guy said he wanted to kill the king. Let's kill him for that. So the question is, was that a legal requirement, or was that just tradition, a practice that grew up around this poorly designed law in order to try to make some logical sense out of it? Now we're, but that, interestingly, that gives rise then to this modern theory of conspiracy. Well, you have to do something or make some effort to manifest the thing in the plane of reality and not just in the imagination of somebody who's imagining what you might be imagining. That can't be the basis for this. At any rate, we return to the article. It actually says, at any rate, the concept that conspiracy should require an overt act was well developed at the time of the Constitution. That was several years later, right? 1351. So like 7 years after 1351, or several hundred years, whichever it might be, 400 and something years, 430 years later, framing of the Constitution. They had a lot of time to think about it. Nearly half a millennium passes between 1351 and 1787. So, okay. At any rate, the concept that conspiracy should require overt acts is well developed at the time of the Constitution, for almost 500 years later, as reflected in the Constitution's carefully narrow definition of treason. Remember, it was the Treason Act that we were talking about in 1351. How does the Constitution deal with it? No person shall be convicted of treason unless on the testimony of two witnesses to the same, what? The same overt act. Overt act. They actually use those words in the Constitution. Show me in the Constitution where it says overt act is a thing. It's right here. Oh, I didn't realize that. So, two witnesses to the same overt act or on confession in open court. If you confess to the treason, that'll do. Thank you very much. All of this reflected several traditions and sensibilities. The first was recent memory of how many accusations of treason and conspiracy had roiled England and led to violence and tyranny. Another, given the notoriously hard-drinking life of the founders, is that what a bunch of idiots agree to do in their cups and what they are interested in, I would say, putting into effect in the morning are two very different things. As one scholarly work puts it, you see what he's getting at? Fancy language. You're saying, well, there's a lot of drunks, disgruntled drunks hanging around among the colonials and the founding fathers, etc. And so muttering into your cup, bastard king, why we ought to get rid of him. That's one thing. But yeah, when you sober up the next day, did you then continue your plan? Yes, I'll get some axes and sharpen them up, and we'll use them to assassinate government officials and or the king if he should for some reason sail all the way over here and present himself to us. Those people will round up. Drunken idiots who mutter into their cups that they hate the king. Well, for purposes of not clogging up the court system and allowing us to hang everybody, we'll just let that go for now. So, the scholarly work discussed it this way. The treason definition used by the Constitution requiring two witnesses to the same overt act, etc. Its primary purpose is to show the operation of the conspiracy. Put another way, the requirement of an overt act represents an acknowledgement that talk is cheap. A second purpose of the overt act is to provide a locus, some Latin here, locus ponentiae, perhaps. I can't read the Latin. And it's got diphthongs in there, and so I'm not going to be good with that. But at any rate, that is, in more plain English language, a chance for a conspirator to withdraw from the conspiracy without accruing any liability, a backdoor, an escape valve, somewhere between, yeah, we should do that, and okay, I'll actually do something that furthers the conspiracy, you know. We should absolutely do that. All right, well then your job is sharpen the axes. I'm going to move to North Carolina instead and not hang around here in Boston. I'm not sharpening the axes. I realize that that's a problem. Are you out of the conspiracy now? Traditionally speaking, yes. So, the overt act requirement is intended to limit the definition of conspiracies and ensure that only people who have actually conspired are indicted. The requirement should, for example, prevent mere braggarts from being prosecuted for, quote, agreeing to rob a bank or kill a political figure with whom they particularly disagree. Back to Pope Hat here. So, you can think of an overt act as a sort of evidentiary requirement, and overt acts as evidence of a criminal conspiracy, not the crimes themselves. So no emailing somebody about Mike Pence or calling him a wimp. While it's an overt act, it isn't a crime, and it was never supposed to be a crime. That wasn't why it was being offered. It was just evidence of the conspiracy, not the conspiracy or itself, nor a crime in itself. These days, the custom is for prosecutors to use the overt act requirement to tell the story of the case at length in the indictment. Prosecutors also use it as a gambit to make it more likely that evidence will be admitted at trial. It's a strong case to admit evidence of something if you've called it out as an overt act. And often try to connect every defendant to an overt act, even though it's not a requirement, just so the defendants can't say at trial, look, I didn't even commit an overt act. So I guess what he's trying to say here is that's why conspiracy indictments, RICO indictments, tend to be lengthy documents. And including all of the overt acts that demonstrate that somebody has played a part in an alleged conspiracy, you got to lay all that stuff out. And when you do that, it tends to be, one, it forms a narrative all by itself, and two, that narrative tends to be fairly lengthy. But as he says, even though not every participant in a conspiracy needs to participate in an overt act at all, just so long as somebody else does and then you do something else that in some way connects you to it, it's very often the case that prosecutors will leave people unindicted unless they can find an overt act that they participated in, so that they can have a stronger claim to including you as a co-conspirator. Otherwise, defendants, any opportunity they can get to get out of the indictment, they will take. That by itself, under the way the law has been interpreted, probably shouldn't get you dismissed from the indictment, but it could if, the rest of the evidence against you is particularly weak. So if they can connect you to an overt act, that's an automatic ticket to trial. So they attempt to do that for everyone. Now, overt acts, the next section is titled, overt acts are the evidence of a criminal conspiracy, not the crime themselves. He's reiterating this point. Once you view overt acts as sort of evidence, it's easier to see why they don't have to be crimes themselves and why they can even be acts that would otherwise be not only legal, but protected speech. The First Amendment, of course, protects my right to indulge in nationalistic and racist rants against, say, the Belgians. Popat says, I wouldn't say it justifies anything against the Belgians because I love Belgians. I don't know. If my friends and I engage in loud calls to kill all the Belgians and walk up and down my Belgian neighbor's house observing the entrances and exits, and if I ask my priest whether it is morally and scripturally appropriate to kill the Belgians, all of those things individually are legal and protected by the First Amendment. Yes, even though you're casing the joint to murder him, that by itself would, like in the bad faith construction, they would say, what, now it's illegal to walk around the block? I mean, come on. Well, put it all together and you have something. Right? Okay. All of these things are legal and protected by the First Amendment, but if my Belgian neighbor winds up murdered in his bed, those things are all evidence that I did it and of my intent when I did it. And also potentially overt acts in a conspiracy with my anti-Belgian friends to do it. You see how that begins to transform things? And that's one of the big objections to racketeering and conspiracy law in general, is that it tends to convert things that by themselves are not and ought not to be considered crimes into, if not crimes themselves, then overt acts as part of a criminal indictment for conspiracy. It criminalizes that which otherwise would not normally have been criminal. But remember, again, it makes sense to do it. Taken in isolation, walking around the block and observing the entrances and exits to a neighbor's house might be weird, but you can't prove that you were, scanning the exits and entrances. But I mean, if someone thought you were doing that and was able to testify as to such, well, then you might say, well, all I'm doing is observing what's out there in public view. There's nothing wrong with that. Yes, but we're talking about in context, where you've been walking around for days saying, I would like to walk into my neighbor's house and murder him in his bed. And then someone walked in and murdered him in his bed. And you used to say that all the time, and then people observed you actually doing it. Couldn't we say, logically, that perhaps this is not, if not proof that you did it? Remember the difference between evidence and proof? At least evidence that you did some things that would tend to prove that you may have been the one who did it. Yes. Is it conclusive all by itself? No. But is it enough to bring it to court and say, well, finder of fact, Mr. and Mrs. Jury, what do you think? The fact that he was walking around threatening to do this and then did all the things that somebody who was intent on doing it might otherwise have been observed doing, and then someone turned up dead. Does it prove he did it? No. Does it tend to prove that he did it? Is it the sort of thing you could look at and say, yeah, I think I would draw that conclusion? It's circumstantial evidence. It's not hard evidence like video of you doing the murder, but it is something that you're permitted to draw a conclusion from. So we admit it as evidence. And we likewise would admit, yes, it can be considered an overt act in proving a conspiracy. Now, American law, he continues on, is quite clear on this distinction. The overt act, without proof of which a charge of conspiracy cannot be submitted to the jury, may be that of only a single one of the conspirators and need not itself be a crime. Georgia law is the same. This United States federal law comes from Braverman versus United States, a 1942 case. Hi everybody, it's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and patreon.com, patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Into our last segment for the day. But let's continue on with this exposition on the difference between acts which would otherwise by themselves not be crimes, but in the context of conspiracy are considered overt acts. And then, of course, the predicate acts, which we haven't even gotten to yet. But we better hurry up and get to it because I think it's very important that everybody understand this as the trial moves closer, although we're really only at the surrender at the end of the week stage at all of this. But the sooner we understand it, the better. And it helps you combat the disingenuous bad faith objections to charging Trump and others under conspiracy statutes. Now, we'll continue on here. That says somewhat less clear is the concept that an overt act, since it is only evidence of the criminal conspiracy, not the crime itself, may be speech protected by the First Amendment. That, of course, being used as a bad faith excuse for much of what's been charged here. Back in 1957, Justices Black and Douglas, two of the most important thinkers on the First Amendment, had a rip-snorting debate on this concept in the dissent of one of the anti-communist cases, arguing rather persuasively that at the least the government should have to prove that at least one covert act is not protected by the First Amendment in order to convict someone of conspiracy. But the Supreme Court has not adopted that rule, and the current law seems to be, because it's always subject to change, seems to be this. It's not the speech that is made criminal, but rather the agreement. And whether the overt act is constitutionally protected speech would be irrelevant, you see. But it was an interesting theory that they put forth in attempting to afford defendants more rights. Well, shouldn't at least one of the overt acts have to be a crime in itself? a good point, a good argument. But upon consideration, the court just didn't agree. They said, well, there can be a number of things that you do that all of them by themselves are not crimes, but taken together, the totality of circumstances are such that we still believe a crime was committed here. And we've described a crime committed entirely in legal acts, but in context and taken together means something else. Yes, it's not illegal to say you don't like your neighbor. Yes, it's not illegal for you to walk past their house. Yes, it's not even illegal for you to meet with your neighbors about and discuss how much you dislike them. But it is illegal if the person's been murdered. It can be considered, it's not, again, each of these acts isn't illegal. What's illegal is the conspiracy to kill them, right? And, of course, murdering them. But the conspiracy as well, which is what you would use to rope in people who didn't hand you knives or actually stab the person or even help you open the door. But if you can, in the totality of circumstances, show that all of these listed acts were in furtherance of an agreement to kill this person, that's something. The totality of circumstances is very important here. So, where were we, right? The current Supreme Court thinking, which could be subject to change, of course, is that it's not speech that's criminal, but rather the agreement, and whether the overt act is constitutionally protected speech is irrelevant in proving whether or not there was an agreement which is criminal. This has continued to be the rule, notably during the Great War on Terror. Now, another quote from Supreme Court precedent here. This case here, well, it picks up in the middle, but it doesn't give us the citation. If I click through just so we can get it, I'll mention it. U.S. versus Sattar is what it looks like. Sattar. And I'm not familiar with much of the pronunciation of all of these war on terror cases that took place after I graduated from law school. But otherwise, we would have heard these things pronounced out loud. Anyway, or if I was in current practice at any point during the war on terror, which was not the case either. But here we are from US v. Sattar. Moreover, even if Abdel Rahman's words, you can see what kind of words they're concerned about here just by listening to the name, that what sort of thing lands you in court? The words of someone named Abdel Rahman. I know that's prejudicial all by itself, but in this case, it's true that this is what he was accused of. Moreover, even if Abdel Rahman's words were protected speech, it is not his words, but his agreement that is criminalized in the Count 2 conspiracy. In United States ex rel Epton v. Nena, the 1971 case in the Second Circuit, in case you need to look it up, the Court of Appeals rejected the argument that the defendant's conviction for conspiracy to riot violated his rights under the First Amendment because the overt acts alleged in the indictment were all constitutionally protected speech. It's a fun argument. It didn't work for the defendant in that case. The Court of Appeals disagreed with the premise of the defendant's argument and concluded that, in fact, some of the overt acts were actually unprotected. That didn't help, surely. Additionally, however, the court reasoned, in case that wasn't enough for you, or in case they hadn't agreed as such, they could still say that when a defendant is convicted of conspiracy to commit an unlawful act, it is not the speech that is made criminal, but rather the agreement, once again. And whether the overt act is constitutionally protected speech would be irrelevant. Is this right? Popat asks. Were Black and Douglas right in 1957? To say that really shouldn't at least one of the overt acts have to be illegal in itself? How exactly does this mesh with the complex and ill-defined First Amendment exception for speech inherent to criminal conduct? Well, the real answer is, hell if I know. But that, for now, is the law. Is that very satisfactory? No. Is that the basis from which a decidedly conservative Supreme Court might decide to change the law? Maybe But that would be awfully ironic, considering that for our purposes and in this context, the decidedly conservative members of the Supreme Court are usually for, quote-unquote, law and order and being, quote-unquote, tough on crime and cracking down. And these defendants' rights idiots are ruining everything. But when the defendant is one of their own, maybe it's kind of awesome to ruin everything. They could come up with something that has been denied your basic indigent or disfavored defendant for decades, but suddenly realize, yeah, the state's really been unfairly cracking down on defendants and we need to give them a fair shake in fighting back when the full weight of the government is brought down on their heads, especially if they are white Republicans or even orange Republicans who are in the dock. So, I mean, it should be under consideration, and it's been a long time coming, but I guess you can analogize it to our modern dilemma about cannabis law, right? For how many years have we been putting black defendants in prison for having some de minimis amount of marijuana, and then we say, you know what, we got to end this war on drugs. It's crazy, it's too costly, it's costing people their lives and livelihoods, and we'll start by saying that white people selling it, we're going to decriminalize. And if you sell it in a way that white people recognize as commerce, that's fine. But if it looks a little shady, like street corner selling of loose cigarettes, well, that we're going to crack down on. It's similar in that sense. Like, okay, we finally come around to, all right, maybe we won't be convicting even black defendants on simple possession anymore, but only after deciding that, well, now white people are facing this, and so maybe we've been doing it wrong the whole time. So, there's more, though. Next section, but wait, there's also racketeering acts. Yes, we're finally going to get to this other stuff, too. So, to the extent the Georgia RICO indictment lists mundane and non-criminal things as overt acts, or even protected speech, that's all perfectly legal, for better or for worse. But Fani Willis has chosen to draft the indictment in a way that causes further complication and confusion by putting two different things in the same list of acts. Overt acts in support of the conspiracy, which don't have to be crimes, and racketeering acts, which do have to be crimes. The Georgia RICO Act makes it illegal to engage in a pattern of racketeering activity. That's defined elsewhere as committing two or more crimes from a list of specified crimes. So that list in the indictment reflects things that are just overt acts and things that are identified as specific crimes constituting acts of racketeering and that are also overt acts. In other words, defining squares and what do they say? Or squares and parallelograms. You know, not all parallelograms are squares, but all squares are parallelograms. So I forget the analogy that they used to use for all those things. But anyway, I think that was it. That's the basics of it. So all overt acts, or all crimes involve overt acts, but not all overt acts are crimes. So, I guess Pope had his upset about the 161 act list not internally differentiating between those things which are not necessarily crimes but are definitely overt acts, and those things which are themselves crimes and therefore are racketeering acts, but are also by themselves overt acts that help illustrate what the totality of circumstances were, the various parts of the conspiracy. Some of those are racketeering acts and overt acts, and some of them are just overt acts, and shouldn't they have been designated as such? It doesn't really matter. It doesn't require it. Maybe the taxonomy would be helpful for people understanding it, but we have this explainer instead. So, what does he mean? What are some of the racketeering acts that are also overt acts? He picks out number 42 and 43 here. And to shorten the reading of it, we're talking about the December 7th, 2020. Trump committed the felony offense of solicitation of violation of oath by public officer in violation of the Georgia Code. It's all here in Fulton County, Georgia, by unlawfully soliciting, requesting, and importuning Speaker of the Georgia House of Representatives David Ralston, a public officer, to engage in conduct constituting the felony offense of violation of oath by public officer by calling a special session of the Georgia General Assembly for the purpose of unlawfully appointing presidential electors from Georgia in willful and intentional violation of the terms of the oath of said person as prescribed by law, with intent that said person engage in said conduct. This was, among other things, an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. You see what we're talking about here? If he had called him and said, why don't you just declare this thing to be true, right? And it's what he did. And bring together the assembly and vote for new electors. Well, that's two things. One, it's an overt act. I picked up the phone and called you and importuned you to do this. And two, the thing I asked you for. Well, now it's illegal to tell him to call a special session and name fake electors? Yes, that actually is a crime. It is, in addition to being an overt act, an act of racketeering. It is a violation of the law against solicitation of a public officer to violate their oath of office. Act 43, similarly, says on December 8th, 2020, Trump placed a telephone call. Now it's a crime to place a telephone call. Well, hold on. A telephone call to Georgia Attorney General Chris Carr for the purpose of making false statements concerning fraud in the election in Georgia and elsewhere. And during the telephone call, Trump asked Carr not to discourage other state attorneys general from joining a federal lawsuit filed by the state of Texas contesting the administration of the November 3rd, 2020 presidential election in Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. This, too, was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. But not just that, it's also a crime to importune the Attorney General of Georgia to violate their oath of office, et cetera, I would say. But actually, it's not charged here. So maybe this is offered by way of illustrating the difference between the two. Because I noticed, now that I'm looking at it again, Act 42 has a specific Georgia statute which was violated. 43 doesn't list it, although it could certainly, you could imagine it being a violation of the same, but it's not entirely clear that they think so. Let me read on and see whether they call that out or not. Call me an insufferable pedant or worse, Popat says. A former federal prosecutor, I see. Call me an insufferable pedant or worse, a former federal prosecutor. But for clarity, I would have separated the things that the government says are racketeering acts from the things that are just being identified as overt acts, particularly in a case of such historical interest and in an area with such potential for confusion. And I guess I just confused them right in front of you. The fact that they are subsequently listed as Act 42 and 43 leads you to think that perhaps Act 43 is being alleged as an act of racketeering by violating the Code of Virginia, Section 16-10-1, as Act 42 does. But you'll notice on closer reading, they don't actually say that Act 43 violates the same or any particular piece of the Georgia Code. But the fact that they're listed one after the other leads you to want to come to that conclusion. And I guess Popat's complaint there then is Act 42 ought to be in a list of things that are racketeering acts, and at a separate list ought to list things that are overt acts. But it's important that they be listed chronologically because it does tell the story. So if you listed it differently, like if you read on page 14 that on or about the 7th day of December 2020, Trump calls the Speaker of the House of Georgia and says, I want you to call a special session of the General Assembly for the purpose of unlawfully appointing presidential electors from Georgia. And that by virtue of the fact that it violates a particular statute in Georgia, is on a different list and appears on page 14. But then on page 111, they then say, oh, by the way, also on the 8th day of December, the very next day, Trump calls the Georgia Attorney General and says, I want to allege fraud in the election, and I want you to stop discouraging other state attorneys general from joining Texas's lawsuit to overturn the election results. Well, I guess they're saying here, well, that doesn't necessarily violate, or he's not importuning the attorney general to violate their oath of office. He's just trying to get them to not join a case, or at least stop discouraging others from joining the case. But he doesn't have any jurisdiction in other states, so he's not using his official capacity per se to pressure other state attorneys general into staying away from Texas's case. So they don't allege any racketeering act there. But it's important in the totality of the circumstances. This is a story of Trump calling everybody he can in Georgia and trying to get them to leverage their official positions in ways that would position him to overturn the election results. And if you listed them separately, it would be very difficult to put them together again as a coherent narrative if you read them several hours or even several days apart. And you wouldn't necessarily, what you would end up doing, trying to organize the case in your own head, if it was important to you to do so, would be putting together a chronological timeline, such that you would end up with something exactly like what the indictment presents. And so long as the indictment doesn't say that Act 43 is a violation of this particular Georgia code, the fact that it comes listed after something that was a violation of the code, well, if you confuse it, that's your problem. If you're a member of the jury, you might want to take some notes and separate them, and you may end up separating them into two separate lists, just like Popat suggests, but that won't be the way they're presented at trial. That'll be your job to separate it. So it's really just him kind of complaining about how easy it is to confuse the two kinds of events. True, but so what? That's the job. Unconfuse them. So, okay. That's very interesting. Next up, leaning into the controversy or indifferent to it. What are we talking about? He writes, so that's how, in charging a conspiracy to violate Georgia's RICO statute, you wind up with a list consisting of both specific alleged criminal acts and mundane acts, including acts otherwise protected by the First Amendment. In my view, the Georgia RICO indictment is gratuitous, self-indulgent, and careless of the appearance of legitimacy. Yes, under current law, protected speech acts can be overt acts, but that doesn't mean a prosecutor should gratuitously include such acts. There are so many arguable crimes that serve as both overt acts and racketeering acts, and so many communications that expressly incorporate fraud and deceit that it would have been easy to draft an indictment to leave out tweets and speeches and the like. Putting them in seems like leaning into the pro-Trump talking points and accepting accusations of overt political bias. But I don't think so. I disagree. I actually think it tells a much more coherent story and presents, remember, in order to make a conspiracy charge even work, it's all about the totality of the circumstances. And if you are purposefully leaving out some significant portion of the totality of the circumstances, for the purposes of making the mental organization and the mental separation of overt acts from racketeering acts easier for people, for whom? Who does it matter for, really, except for the jury? And at that point, it's the defense's job to separate those things and to remind the jury that they might be interested in separating them in their consideration of what's going on. But it's the job of the prosecution to tell the story of the totality of those circumstances. And who writes the indictment? The prosecutor. It's curious that White, as a former prosecutor, has that complaint versus as a former defense attorney, but he's a conservative at heart and clearly, obviously, places some real value in the limitations that justices, who was it? I can't remember who it was, Black and Douglas in 1957, saying, well, really, shouldn't there be some requirement of at least one of the overt acts be a criminal act all by itself? Good theory, just not the law. But sometimes you press for that in the hopes that someone will change their minds, but not usually as a federal prosecutor, usually as a defense attorney. Anyway, it's really just a matter of preferences in terms of how you present the story. He prefers to present the Jack Smith version of things, although he might have had the same complaint about Jack Smith, because that complaint came up too. But he prefers a more sparing description and let the totality narrative be presented then to the jury. He might just say, you have a point. It only matters if you present this to the jury. So why are you presenting it to everyone else? Why are you trying this crime in the court of public opinion? And part of the answer can just by itself be, 'cause I can. And part of the answer can be, let's talk once more about who this defendant is and what they're likely to try to do in the interim here. We need to tell this story because they're going to tell lies as well as their own version of this story, which might not by itself be a lie, but they'll embellish it with lies. And we'll be standing there waiting possibly until April of 2026 to tell our version of the story. So no, we're not going to wait. And yes, conspiracy requires a thorough examination of the totality of the circumstances by its nature, so we opted to do that. But that's not how he feels about it. To continue with his feelings about it, the indictment also suffers from a lack of framing language that puts in context the difference between lawful and unlawful political acts. Jack Smith did a good job of this in the D.C. indictment against Trump, which similarly set out to tell a complex story. And he quotes from it in saying, the defendant had a right, like every American, to speak publicly about the election and even to claim falsely that there had been outcome determinative fraud during the election and that he had won. He was also entitled to formally challenge the results of the election through lawful and appropriate means, such as by seeking recounts or audits of the popular vote in states or filing lawsuits challenging ballots and procedures. Indeed, in many cases, the defendant did pursue these methods of contesting the election results. His efforts to change the outcome in any state through recounts, audits, or legal challenges were uniformly unsuccessful. Shortly after Election Day, the defendant also pursued unlawful means of discounting legitimate votes and subverting the election results. In so doing, the defendant perpetrated 3 criminal conspiracies, and he goes on to list them. But I will say this, there's an alternative viewpoint has already been presented on the show. Not that it was prevented me from presenting it as well over the last hour. But whose work was it? Was it Dahlia Lithwick that we were talking about? Where she was, or whoever it was who was writing about it, if I've misattributed it, was saying how the 2 indictments were so perfectly complementary to one another. One that was bare bones, but illustrated a broader conspiracy against the United States, Jack Smith's, or one that was excruciatingly detailed, but focused primarily on state law violations and the violations of law that targeted individuals inside of Georgia, the elections workers, as well as the people in general in Georgia, and that they cover all bases between the 2 of them. There's no perfect way to do this necessarily. But it's just 2 different approaches, but different approaches to different kinds of conspiracies, too. In some ways, if you are trying to illustrate a more nebulous and ill-defined set of laws which have been violated, as Jack Smith's indictment seeks to do, it helps get you there if the structure of the narrative is more bare bones. There's less chance to get lost in everything. But where the crime is so specific, and some of the crimes that are alleged in the Georgia indictment are in fact quite specific and are limited to just 1 or 2 people, then you might say, well, if all he's doing is saying he dislikes these people, how could that be a criminal act? Well, again, you need the totality of circumstances to understand why there's a crime charged here. And no, the crime isn't saying that these 2 election workers were terrible people. It's everything else that went with it. And so you're going to have to present everything else that went with it. It makes sense to me. So at any rate, he concludes here, and now we're going to run out of time because there was so much commentary. he finishes up with the quote from Jack Smith saying, okay, well, there's lawful and unlawful means done here. And he pursued these 3 criminal conspiracies. Then he stops. Back to his commentary. That sort of table setting costs nothing and contributes tremendously to promoting the public understanding of the distinction between protected political speech and unlawful fraud. Similarly, Smith went out of his way to identify overt acts that were clearly fraudulent, that had the wrongdoing evident and built in. The different styles reflects different prosecutorial cultures. Federal prosecutors are, on average, much more cautious and risk-averse than district attorneys. Federal judges are somewhat, not nearly enough, more willing to force federal prosecutors to follow rules and call them out on BS. By contrast, state judges, who are often elected and used to seeing colleagues who are soft on crime lose their seats, tend to let district attorneys get away with much more. That's not untrue. This can promote a defiant attitudes, I don't know why A is in there, with local prosecutors believing that any barrier to doing whatever they want is a grave, illegitimate injustice. Before Ms. Willis took office, an appellate court rebuked the Fulton County District Attorney's Office for making a bizarre argument defending a conviction, and then they leaned into it as a point of pride, making Bizarre for Justice t-shirts. Apparently this embedded tweet illustrates that, but it's about time for us to start rolling out of here. Let's read just a little bit more before we roll the music. Fani Willis is a darling of people who hate Trump right now. I think Trump and his team committed crimes, Popat says, and that the indictment captures some of them. But, as has been common for the last 5 years, Trumpian cases tend to flip the script and make people who would be skeptical of law enforcement into credulous law enforcement fans and vice versa. That is a good point. That leads us to ignore cultural problems with prosecutors. Some of the drafting of this indictment strikes me as gratuitous, unsound, unnecessarily invoking First Amendment and political concerns, and kind of sloppy. But I don't actually think it's because Fani Willis is an anti-Trump zealot, at least not primarily. I think it's because she's a classic DA, kind of arrogant, kind of entitled, dismissive of arguments and concerns about how her office wields power, confident, usually justifiably, that judges won't hold her to account, and tending to view constitutional and statutory rights as obstacles rather than as accepted rules. In a perfect world, fans of Fani Willis would think about how this approach works when applied to people who aren't, who fit rich or famous or conservative. For instance, how many people can defend themselves if Fani Willis decides to add them to a 28-count indictment for RICO, where jury selection alone has taken 8 months? Can any DA be trusted to wield the RICO statute fairly, or will they inevitably resort to using it to strong-arm court reporters for using the wrong font to make more money? And linked to something that proves that, I guess. In that same perfect world, Trump supporters, or any anti-Trump folks, would have an epiphany. Holy crap, we'll say. If they can do this to Trump and his crew, what are they doing to regular folks? Is my trust in police and prosecutors misplaced? It isn't pretty to think so. But at any rate, some good points being made, and some not so great points too, but all in the service of explaining the difference between overt acts that are crimes and those that are not, so you can help see through the crap.
Radio.com. You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
All right, next up, of course, Justice Putnam with the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. What's he got here today? The January 6th honchos got to sit around for 3.5 years without facing legal action, but I guess that time's running out. On the rest of the menu, cops in a Virginia town, which one, are facing blowback for allowing members of a far-right extremist group to march on school grounds, there's more, openly toting military-style rifles. Stay tuned for more.